Amen. Christ and Him crucified is at the very center of this conference. We intend to be faithful to God's Word and what the gospel is. And we meant to encourage and help pastors who are trying to be faithful to that message in their local churches. And what we're going to be having throughout this conference is a series of brief conversations with various other brothers who are speaking or attending here about topics related to or spinning off from the things that we're talking about. And one of the most obvious things we thought to address at the beginning of the panel is the fact that there is so much obvious division we've seen in our churches and certainly in the larger culture, but even in our churches over these last few years. And a question we had is, how can we be, or what does it mean to be, together for the gospel when we're so divided? So, HB, what does it mean to be together for the gospel when we're so divided? And because it's your first time here at this conference, I should just start this year. You just say this is HB Charles Jr., pastor of the Shiloh Metropolitan Baptist Church in Jacksonville, Florida, and a repeat preacher here at the conference, which we are very thankful for. If you're looking for another conference after this one's done, Cutting It Straight, right down there in Jacksonville, open for all the preachers of the gospel. People want to hear good preaching.
Yeah, I think where you started us is a good place for us to begin that conversation. After the first 3 chapters of Ephesians, the 4th chapter begins with how to walk this out. And the first emphasis there is to walk in unity and to preserve the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. And I think the relationships, I think sometimes we look at events and organizations and institutions, but the local church is the hope of the world. And where there's unity there in our local churches around the gospel of Jesus Christ, and then among pastors, behind these events, beyond these kinds of events, I think that's a reason to be encouraged. Over the past months in my own travel, I have bumped into people talking about this week. And the conversation has not been merely about the books and the sermons and the singing, but relationships that have come through this, and encouragement of like-minded brothers and sisters in the faith that has encouraged them to go on. I think our relationships around the truth matter, and I think that's a reason for us to be encouraged in the midst of division.
So HB, since you are a preacher who preaches at conferences, not just in your own local church, let me just ask a couple of questions about this kind of togetherness. Are you friends with everybody that you speak at a conference with?
I don't necessarily know everyone I speak at a conference with.
All right, so that's no. It's not you just like them, but it's just like the fact that you're speaking at the same conference doesn't even mean you know some of the other people.
Yes.
Yeah. And then on the other hand, are you friends with people that you don't speak at the same conferences with?
Absolutely.
Like pastors?
Absolutely.
Other pastors? Yeah. So we've got relationships that are together. They're not insuperably divided over these last 2 years. Have these last 2 years been hard on relationships for you with other pastors or inside your church?
Well,
I mean, obviously answer whatever way is publicly edifying.
My church doesn't live on Twitter, so some things that are going on in the larger church world are not the primary focus. But I'm also rooted and raised in a church culture where there is a lot of grace, where there are brothers near me in our city where we would disagree on things that are important to us, secondary matters, but things that are very important to us. We will find points of commonality, ways we can serve together, even times we can worship together. And we behind the scenes may say, I think you're crazy about that, and I disagree with you on that. But there's a bond of the gospel that binds us together. And I think it's important among pastors that we express that.
Greg, same question for you on, does together for the gospel mean anything when so many people are so divided?
Sure, as long as...
Sorry, Greg Gilbert, pastor of Third Avenue Baptist Church, right here in Louisville, Kentucky.
Yeah, welcome to Louisville. It's a great city, great food. Hope you guys have a great time just getting to know Louisville a little bit. So glad to have you all here in our fair city.
And your church, it meets just about 10 blocks south of here?
Yeah, right down near the University of Louisville. Yeah, stone building, been there 130 years. So, and a lot has happened over those 130 years, right? There have been a lot of divisions. There have been a lot of disagreements among Christians, among people who would declare themselves to be evangelicals, and through all of it, that church and the gospel it's preached has endured. And so I think even in a time where people are disagreeing about things and you know, even in places like Twitter at each other's throats, it seems like it's important to recognize that it's the gospel that we proclaim, which has a definite content to it. It's not something that we get to redefine every generation. And the church that then proclaims that is finally the foundation of the unity that we enjoy. So the promise of being together for the gospel, if we translate that into biblical promises, that would be something we see like in Matthew 16 with Christ's promise to the church, not to a conference like this. Yeah, that's right. I mean, you look over the last even 20, 30 years, much less the last 100 or 200 or 300, conferences are going to rise and fall, denominations will rise and fall, magazines and websites and podcasts and all the rest will rise and fall. Jesus never promised that the gates of hell would not prevail against any of those. What he promised is the gates of hell will not prevail against my church that preaches my gospel. So, you know, if we've got that word gospel defined well, the togetherness will follow, I think, pretty naturally from that, even as we hash out things that are, you know, frankly, really, really important in these years.
And some divisions are old, like the divisions between me and Lig. You know, there's some differences over understanding of church polity and one of the ordinances. Baptism. That's the one I was thinking. Yes. There are also ways in which we have learned what we can do and be together, even with those divisions. Kind of like what HB, I guess what you're talking about, maybe in Jacksonville with other pastors. Ligon, you've been in T4G since the beginning of this conference. What does it mean to have this title, Together for the Gospel, when there has been so much division in the last few years?
We were saying before the panel started that the kinds of things that we struggled to overcome were different in 2006 than now. So we knew it was an interesting group of people that came together in Louisville in 2006. Continuationists and cessationists. Baptists and Presbyterians, that's an older division. But people from fundamentalist bodies who were a little bit worried about folks that would associate in broader evangelical circles, intrigued by the fact that we were willing to draw really big, bold theological lines on important doctrines. And so in that moment in 2006, there was a lot of coming together for the first time with some different groups that didn't normally associate or interact. And that was incredibly encouraging to all of us. And it remained encouraging for the next 6 years. There was a lot of excitement and encouragement about it. And we hit 2012. And by the way, if you want a quick description of some of the things that have happened since 2012, Shai Lin's book on the New Reformation actually gives a timeline of some of the things that began to unravel our unity. And I really think it's helpful to think through. But now the things in the last few years that have drawn a lot of attention have been things like race, social justice, police, politics, and pandemic. And I find that even in local churches. You know, I'll go to local churches that have divided over how to handle the pandemic. And I'll speak to a pastor who says, well, you know, I've had members leave because I'm not pro-mask enough. And then I've had members leave because I'm not anti-mask enough. And so pastors feel caught in between about how they respond to the pandemic, and then politics, and then how to process what's been going on in terms of race and social justice in the culture. You don't have the same guy in the same church with two different groups of people disappointed that he's been to something and not something enough. So I've seen this playing out at the local level, not just at the conference level. And that shouldn't surprise us. Look, if you look at Christian divisions over the last 500 years, very often it is, how is the right way to faithfully respond to what is happening in the culture at the particular moment? You know, to what extent do you engage with the culture? To what extent do you withdraw from the culture? To what extent do you sort of speak truth to power to the culture? To what extent do you try and woo the culture with the gospel? And that it's brought division in churches over the last 500 years, and I think we're seeing that play out right now. Now, you and I were talking last night, and you have 2 or 3 takes on what's been going on. You want to share those?
You know, the ending of this conference has been used by a lot of people as a chance to write the obituary for Young, Restless, and Reformed. Because the initial article in Christianity Today that used that phrase by Colin Hansen was filled with pictures of the first T4G. And that's where that kind of got going from. And while there have been a lot of other associations with it, and then a book Colin wrote, there are a lot of people who see this conference as really standing for a kind of moment. And that the fact that this conference is ending is an identifying marker of that moment ending. Well, as a guy who reads history, I can tell you we usually can't see things like that this close up. But that could be, we'll have to see. But just a couple of observations. Some people may think that, well, with that conference in particular, they tried to paper over differences that were always there, and over time, and just give it a decade or two, the strains and stresses will show themselves and the thing will rip right apart. And yeah, I think there could be some truth in that. Some other people would say, well, you know, some new things have come along that were stresses and strains that we weren't thinking about in 2006. And when those came along, finally there were 2 or 3 of those that were bigger or more important than maybe not our unity in the gospel, but at least our unity enough to have a conference together publicly. And so it's kind of ripped up that unity. And there could be some truth in that. I think, as I've reflected on it, and those who know me well will not be surprised, this is my take, that what we've seen here actually has succeeded, and that there is lots of together for the gospelness, well beyond this conference. I mean, what we wanted to see when we were starting this conference, in part, was cooperation among you all, and outside of your normal lane. So maybe normally you were with your denomination, or with just, you know, your very local pastors. But we wanted to encourage other kinds of cooperation. Maybe remember back in 2010, I think it was, we even tried a cooperation map to get all the addresses and make sure you knew where other people were in your area who were coming to this conference, because we were trying to just engender more gospel cooperation. Well, I'm pretty sure as I go around the country and in missions things, work in other countries, I think a lot of that has succeeded. I think that's something that's not just the 4 of us were doing initially. I think that's something the Holy Spirit was doing and has been doing. And in a sense, I think we can see a lot of manifestations of that. I think this conference is one of them. But I think what has happened is, HB, as you're saying, a lot of relationships have been built that didn't exist before then. And hopefully they're going to be relationships that survive even the individuals, but there's an institutional appreciation between a church, even if its new pastor comes, and a seminary, and a collection of churches, and a mission work in a particular place. I'm thankful for the cooperations that I've seen all over the place, and I'm thankful for the part T4G has had in that, and there certainly are divisions that we've experienced in the conference, in our church, in our convention of churches that we're part of, the 3 of the 4 of us are part of, and you are always welcome. And you know, that we've seen elsewhere, but there are real fruits of unity, even amidst the divisions that are certainly there.
So as I kind of reflect on, this being the last T4G conference, a couple of things come to mind. One is that, Mark, you and I have known each other for 20 something years now, and so we've been talking about this conference since its inception. And my understanding was that when the four of you launched the conference, it was never intended to be a thing in perpetuity anyway. It was meant to sort of have its run and do the good that it does, and that's it. And I noticed, just counting up the years, Mark, that this is the 9th and final T4G conference. So I have to wonder if that was deliberate from the very beginning. Mr. Non-Mark.
The perfect number.
Well, I don't think that was,
a trinity of trinities.
I don't think that was deliberate on the part of CJ or Al or Lee.
The other thing that kind of comes to mind, though, I don't know if you guys felt it, but in the singing of the hymns, I think there is a sense in my heart anyway of, if not sadness, just a little bit of trepidation about what happens when this doesn't exist anymore. Like, who are my people? What's my home, right? Because when I was a young guy, before I became a senior pastor, just kind of looking for my people, Together for the Gospel happened in 2006, 8, 10, and I just sort of, this is where I'm planting my flag and my feet. These are my people. So there is a sense of sort of looking out into a dangerous world at this point and thinking, okay, this thing does seem to be balkanizing a little bit into various camps, and where do I personally land on that? But I think what encourages me as I sort of look out to that gray horizon is part of the whole point of the Together for the Gospel conference has been that you can have men who have deep, like 500-year disagreements with one another about really, really important things, and yet underneath that, at the foundation, we're both preaching the same gospel of Jesus Christ, and that's a really good thing, because evangelicalism is going to sort of start networking itself, right? That's what we're going to do for the next 10 or 15 years, it seems to me like. But I think that's okay, because at the bottom, those various networks are going to be preaching the same gospel, and that's a good thing. That's an encouraging thing.
Praise Him. HB, does this ending of this conference, this doesn't affect you with the same kind of trepidation it does Greg? I mean, you've got your denomination, you've got your pastors in the area you cooperate with, you have your own Cutting It Straight conference.
Yeah, I was a pastor in Los Angeles in